We have another session to finish before we get to our panel, and we really want to highlight one of our own initiatives, the Health Systems Research Seeding Grants, as an initiative which has really been at the forefront of involving consumers in the research applications as well as in their scoring assessment criteria. So we've tried to bring on 2 successful applicants from the 2 years previous to touch on some of their experiences with the grant process and where they're up to. So the first one we have today is from Dr. Holly Evans. Dr. Evans is a postdoctoral fellow at the Behavioural Sciences Unit and the School of Clinical Medicine here at UNSW. So I welcome Holly to the stage.
Thanks. Short person microphone. So yes, I am Holly Evans. I was a CI on this grant, which was led by Dr. Ursula Sensen-Daly. She's not able to be here today, so I have the pleasure of talking to you about some of the things that we've been doing the last couple of years and the findings and learnings. So I guess the project is about engaging young people who have cancer in conversations about end of life and palliative care concepts. So and adolescence, I think, is this, it's a paradox of emerging capabilities and diminishing possibilities. So in Australia, we talk about adolescents and young adults, or AYAs, being aged 15 to 25. So in that age group, you're really kind of coming up against all of these possibilities, these, kind of emerging independence. But also when you have cancer, it's a time when you often have to rely more on your family, your parents. Maybe there's a bit of kind of independence regression. So it's a really difficult time for these young people. And I think at the moment there's about 85% 5-year cure rate for adolescents and young adults in Australia, which means that some of these AYAs, they won't survive, and palliative care and end-of-life care are going to be really important for them. So the ability to have those conversations in a really open, honest, inclusive way is really important. And part of the reason, I guess, that we know that we need to have these conversations, as healthcare professionals, these conversations need to be had with families and the young people, because not talking about these things in the young person can lead to things like greater anxiety, poorly managed pain, not dying in the place that they might wish to, and this sense of dying in emotional isolation where you don't have the opportunity to really talk about the things that are bothering you with the people who you love. We also know that for parents, not having kind of end-of-life discussions, palliative care conversations, can increase their risk of experiencing regret after the young person has died in terms of the choices that were made, but also increased risk of complicated grief. So we also know that if these conversations, if they do happen, they're not well documented, they're often a little bit too late to really act on. And we know that without healthcare professional, health team initiation, they don't tend to happen spontaneously. So that, they tend to occur in less than 3% of families if the healthcare providers are not aware and engaged on that level. So I guess before I introduce the research that we were doing in a bit more detail, I'll just flag, I suppose, some of the, not issues, some of the, challenges of working with AYAs as consumers. So they're quite a dynamic group, more so than I think children or parents and older adults, because they are often at a point in their lives when they're still studying or they're moving out of home, they're having careers, and once they get, I guess, to the point of potential survivorship, because we also can't often talk directly to the young people who are dying at the time that they're dying, for obvious reasons. So the young people that we do tend to talk to, they kind of are difficult to pin down. So having, a group of consumers who sit on a panel or who are engaged on a longer-term, multi-year research project is not as feasible. So we do tend to do a lot of co-design, a lot of workshops, sort of one-to-one conversations about things as we're going. And I suppose we use models where we have a larger group of AYAs, which sort of changes year to year. And I mean, everyone is an individual, whether you're a young person or not, but in speaking to one AYA, you tend to have spoken to one AYA. They have hugely divergent experiences of their cancer, experiences of their background and culture and upbringing. So it's important to engage, I suppose, as many consumers in this age group as you can. There's also, I guess, a huge clinical need for these resources. So the research is really important because these young people are often, I guess, straddling paediatric and adult systems. So there aren't a huge number of interventions or resources or, information available for these young people that's not either a little bit too young or a little bit too old. So for us, our starting point was the American Voicing My Choices tool. So it's an advanced care planning guide, which is about thinking about your preferences for not just for treatment, but for quality of life, for care, for choices after you die, if that happens. But it was also designed in the US by Laurie Weiner and her team, sort of for and by AYAs, so people with cancer and people with HIV. And I suppose this research started because Ursula has a clinical role at Prince of Wales Hospital working as a psychologist with these AYAs. And she'd heard about this tool and thought it sounds great, but some of the content is just not, it's a bit mismatched for Australians. So I suppose the initial information that we were going on for this grant was some work that we'd done interviewing healthcare professionals and young people and some parents. They all kind of seemed to think that the American Voicing My Choices was great, but there were these mismatches in terms of things like language. The health system itself is quite different. And I suppose the takeaway was that it is generally appropriate, it's quite acceptable, but we'd like some changes. And I guess to my point of one AYA being one AYA, we spoke to 17 different AYAs, some of them who were current patients, some of them who were survivors, and they had very, very differing opinions on what we should do with the graphic design for the new tool. So some of them thought it was a mishmash and helter-skelter. Some of them really liked it. It's not too in your face. It's relaxing. Or I probably wouldn't think much of it. So I guess the bottom right is the front page of the new Voicing My Choices Australian tool that we were able to produce. And the next steps for us were to, I guess, develop this into a multi-site pilot with consumer engagement, with healthcare professional engagement, to really think about how, I guess, to evaluate what we'd done, the changes that we'd made, but also to figure out how we can get this actually incorporated and used in the health system. So the HSR collaborative grant that we received in 2023, I guess just to highlight that we had a sort of, baseline questionnaires with some of these AYAs that we interviewed. They worked with local healthcare professionals from, I think, 5 different sites across Australia. The young person gave their opinion of the new tool, sort of did some assessments of mood and how they'd been thinking about the tool in 14 days after, and then some follow-up interviews. The healthcare professionals also gave us some feedback on their experience of using the tool with the young person and their opinions. And at the end, everyone gave their opinion on, I guess, the who, where, how of implementation of the tool. So in some of our initial results on that kind of barriers and facilitators in terms of how we can integrate this best in the health system, pointed to a lot of barriers and facilitators at different levels. So it's not just the individual healthcare professional's experience of having these conversations, it's not the young person's experience, it's the interaction of all of those, the relationship issues, as well as the sort of dynamics of the team and the hospital, the multidisciplinary team, as well as even broader Australian health system and culture. So for us, the next steps are to look at developing targeted solutions to those barriers and to reinforce the facilitators that were found, and to, I guess, incorporate that into clinician training, which will happen, alongside the kind of rollout of the Voicing My Choices. And so to our next point, the amazing kind of support that we got from the health systems research team has led to us having a couple of new quite large grants granted. So the MRFF Clinician Researchers in Health, that's a 4-year project. We do have one young person who is a cancer survivor, who is sort of on the older end because now he's got a job and he's a bit more stable and he can be a chief investigator for us. But that will involve a lot of co-design workshops and a bit more of that collaboration and partnership. We are also both investigators on the new NHMRC Centre for Research Excellence in Paediatric Palliative Care, which looks at children as well as AYAs. And there's just been some really great clinical practice impacts of this as well. So, guidance for Australian paediatric palliative care trainees includes information about the tool. Ursula has done a little bit of kind of online training around communication with airways generally. And we have recently kind of worked out with Canteen and the Youth Cancer Service that they will fund the national distribution of Voicing My Choices in Australia for free for healthcare professionals, which is great. Cool. So, and I forgot to say that the wonderful work on the barriers and facilitators with healthcare professionals was done by our amazing ILP student this year, Justine. But yeah, I mean, this has been a huge project. I think the original study started in 2015. So it's been almost 10 years with a lot of input from a lot of different people, which we're very thankful for. And my email is down there. Ursula's email is down there if anyone wants to reach out to us, but and I'll hang around for questions as well.
Thank you, Holly, and congratulations on a really impactful project, but also for those grants that have been awarded. That's fantastic news. I think it was a really nice case study or an example of how consumer involvement or community involvement changes with the projects and changes with the populations. We need to adapt to these different settings, and that was a really nice example. So next we have Dr. Alison Marshall. Alison is a postdoctoral research fellow and senior lecturer at the Kirby here at UNSW. So welcome, Alison. Thank you.
I just wanted to echo what was previously said. Congratulations to Holly on those massive grants afterwards. That's very encouraging, inspiring for someone like me who's sort of earlier on in the process and starting to think about where I can use some of this pilot data to apply for larger grants. So I just wanted to start by giving a very brief presentation. Happy to take questions, and also we'll be here for the networking if there's specific questions as well, or general. And I just wanted to obviously emphasize the team that we have here. So very multidisciplinary, infectious disease specialist, drug and alcohol obstetrician, also the consumer involvement of Danielle Russell, who's doing her postdoc with us at the Kirby Institute. She sits right next to me, so I have huge advantages in being able to, we can talk, all the time about what's going on with this project, so I fully recognize that benefit. And obviously also Nat Taylor, who's an implementation scientist. So I think what's been quite great about being involved with this specific grant is being pushed to work with people that are outside of my own section and are outside of the Kirby specifically, because it's been great to kind of get varying viewpoints on this. So that's sort of one, for those who are applying for this grant, that's definitely a benefit I'd like to emphasize. Okay, so the BUMP-C study is really focused around a lot of things. There's only so much you can fit into an acronym, obviously. So we're looking at client acceptability and provider, so healthcare acceptability of integrated hepatitis C pregnancy care models. So what we know for sure, and this is largely due to EPI evidence and great quantitative data linkage evidence, is that women are much less likely to initiate hepatitis C treatment than men. So we have great hepatitis C treatment, it cures people. There's no, quote unquote restrictions in Australia for accessing those therapies. But women, it consistently is being shown, both in Australia and globally, are much less likely to take up treatment, particularly women of a particular age group, so 18 to 45. If you have children, you're much less likely to initiate treatment. And the more children you have, the even more less likely are going to initiate treatment. So what's sort of been exciting in this field, but really does open up a lot of questions, is that there's been some clinical data, really great clinical data, showing that women can now receive hepatitis C treatment during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. So there's a lot of excitement around this, and rightly so, because from a healthcare perspective, people are thinking, we have all these interactions with women during pregnancy, they're seeing a lot of specialists, they're seeing a GP, they're seeing a midwife, let's sort of add this hepatitis C treatment during that 3rd trimester. But I think we need to kind of get, while this is great news, we need to sort of understand a little bit about women, particularly marginalized women who have a history or are currently injecting drugs, who, as we all know, have largely stigmatized, mostly, in many settings, but a large part of that occurs in healthcare settings. What do they think about receiving hepatitis C treatment during the 3rd trimester? Who would they like to deliver that for them? So there's a lot of options. And I think the thing that I was not anticipating, and I have become so confused, to be honest with you, is that even when I look at the different healthcare pathways for women, this client group who are on often opiate agonist treatment, may or may not be at risk of hep C, may have hep C, the different pathways that is hospital dependent is shocking to me. It is confusing. So that's the maze image. Like, I'm still trying to figure it out. I'm speaking to specialists and asking them, when do you come into the picture? Like, when does the pediatrician come into the picture? When does the neonatologist come into the picture? When does the gastroenterologist come to the picture? And I'm going through guidelines and I have to contact, whoever the contact information is to say, can you walk me through this? Because it can be really confusing. And it's not even things that would make sense to you necessarily, because it'll say, okay, if you're at risk of hep C, and you speak English well, then you go see the infectious disease specialist. If you don't speak English well, you're going to go to the gastro, or vice versa. And you're like, well, what's the rationale for this? And it's like, well, because so-and-so specialist doesn't want to bring in the translator. Do you see what I mean? So it's all these complications operating within these systems, which is also quite interesting, because you're wondering, these are people within the system. So what's causing it to be so ingrained, and why are we following this pathway? But all this to say, so we're going to be doing a qualitative in-depth interviews with clients and healthcare providers in this space to get a sense of, if we're going to sort of integrate hepatitis C treatment into these other possible settings, midwifery, GP, drug and alcohol settings, what do you think makes the most sense to you? And I have to say that even with just some initial digging in this space, sort of speaking to various healthcare specialists, they're kind of this one specialist said to me, it was if you can figure this out, not that I'm gonna figure this out, but they were quite excited by the concept of can we please streamline this? Because there's so many specialists involved. And it's like, they don't think that the system is really working for them either. So just a couple more slides. So I put developing pathways to impact because it's, it's a bit early doors still, but I do want to emphasize so that with myself, recently I was awarded an NHMRC investigator grant. So I do have a little bit of, I don't know if freedom's the right word, but I'm allowed to kind of think a little bit more big picture in this space. So for me, doing this project, I recognize that it's 1 year, but I'm going to carry it on throughout this NHMRC path and continue to look for grants. And that's why I think it was so inspiring to see Holly's slide, to be like understanding a bit more about which of these larger grants I can apply for. So I kind of can think about big picture. I also think, obviously, too, like, I'm very focused on Hep C because that's my background, but, there's sort of talks on expanding this a little bit larger in terms of like substance use space and not just OAT, not just hepatitis C, but OAT as well, concerns. Something that we have done this year, so I was awarded the grant February 2024. We've created this Bump C community panel, okay? I talked to Danielle, we're sitting right next to each other, but Danielle chairs it. So she's had the first one a month ago, and basically what it is, it's Danielle chairing, there's 4 other, I guess you could say, community representatives in this space. They're from across Australia. They have experience with OAT, they have experience with injecting drug use. Some of them had Hep C while pregnant, some of them had Hep C while, giving birth, some still have Hep C. And the purpose of this community panel is multifold. So one is to kind of, for me, continue to sort of understand what they're also identifying as these potential barriers and facilitators in this space. They also, some of them work at community peer-based organizations. So while they're also speaking to their own experience, I can see that they're also thinking about what they could potentially do within their community organization space and how I, through this project and expanding, can assist them in terms of what do they think might be helpful. They've already brought up like a great solution, or one solution that they would like to continue on with was this idea of like a targeted peer navigator, which makes sense, right? Particularly with that maze. They're like, we need somebody that is a peer that can walk us through this process, that can provide, their clients and their peer-based organization with some information about what to expect, what's going to happen. And I think even particularly like, one woman, for example, gave birth 2 years ago, and she was saying it was just so confusing to her, like post-birth, in terms of like OAT, like her infant, is the infant going through withdrawal? Child services, are they being called? Who is this person I'm talking to? How are they determining like these sort of clinical withdrawal measures? And like, when are we going to leave the hospital? Am I allowed to ask that question that we can leave the hospital? Or does it look like I'm not a good parent if I'm saying, can I leave the hospital? When are we going to go home? So I think there's this huge, issues that need to be kind of explored. The other thing that I wanted to mention, so certainly as part of the application, Danielle was a chief investigator on this as well. Again, I recognize the advantage of having her sit right beside me, but I think also too, what's been great is that Danielle is a little bit earlier on in her career, so she's a postdoc that just came over from the US, so it's been great in terms of her and I kind of, developing her research capacity as well. That's kind of been something that, in some ways is an unintended impact of this specific grant. We have collaboration with a national harm reduction organization. So this is something where, it's one thing where I'm kind of keeping track of how many meetings we are having with them, but obviously, as we all know, impact is about, the quality of these meetings. Like, what are we asking people to do? I'm trying to be very mindful, obviously, when working with harm reduction organization. Like, the person that I'm speaking to is also probably the accountant and is probably like the person involved in the communications and is probably involved in like fundraising efforts. Like, there's a lot going on. So trying to work with these major harm organizations in terms of like what works best for you, how often would you like to meet, what aspects of the project would you like to be involved in, what really interests you. I think what's great with the collaboration with the AVIL so far, so this is a National Injecting Drug Users organization, is one of the women is also going to start her PhD soon. And so her interest is also, loosely sort of involved with this as well. So it's going to be great, I think, in terms of us kind of keeping that ongoing collaboration. Now, I think as you can expect, so we have implementation scientists also that are CIs on this. So everyone's kind of interested in their own component in which they feel that they can like best contribute and are most excited by. But we're also thinking of applying for another grant early next year that really takes this a little bit further and implying a bit more implementation science, particularly with like a health equity lens, which traditionally, to be honest with you, and the implementation scientists would say this, they haven't really involved a lot of health equity lens to some of their research. So this is something that there's been a lot of interest in and we're going to push forward. And then lastly, I think it's just sort of focusing on what sort of additional studies, how can we broaden this, how can we pitch this for larger grant opportunities. I think this is something that the subject matter I have a particular, like a lot of passion in, so I'm sort of making it my drive to be able to get larger funding and to keep this going. So something that was also quite helpful for me was that at the Kirby Institute, there's quite a lot of existing collaborators. And so this slide is sort of more just as kind of like a inspiration in terms of these are all these organizations that are involved with this national program that does Hep C testing, but I think it's also just helpful in terms of like leaning into some of the colleagues to being like, we're putting together a community expert panel. You've had a lot of crossover with peer-based organizations. Are there particular people that you could put forward that you might think might be interested? And that kind of leaning into, I think, a little bit of what these existing organizations that are already happening with the Kirby. Yeah, and so that is it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you to all our presenters for today. I think it was really nice to hear both success stories from the Health Systems Research Seeding Grant and how they can lead to bigger things moving forward and the growth that they can lead to. So I encourage everyone who is not applying to think about applying for this current round, which closes, I think, next month.